The inspiration for this video came from one of the more interesting of the annual Wrestling Observer Awards, the most disgusting promotional tactic. The first winner, if you can call it that, of this prize was in 1981 and is referred to as LaBelle Promotions' usage of the monster, saying he was built in a laboratory. As a sign of the times, California-based LaBelle Promotions was the first of only 4 territories to ever win this award, with WWE winning it 24 out of the past 40 years. Most recently because of this man. Usually because of this man, but last year directly because of this man. But why LaBelle Promotions though? And what was so disgusting about the monster? Promoter Mike LaBelle is the brother of Judo Gene LaBelle, but the two apparently didn't get along, to the point where they would spell their names differently to not be linked to each other. Gene LaBelle, by the way, is maybe best known to modern fans as the innovator of the LaBelle lock, made famous in recent years by Bryan Danielson when he made it to WWE, partly because they weren't thrilled with his previous finishing hold being known as the cattle mutilation. Mike LaBelle first got into promoting by taking over the independent WWA around 1965. At the time they had their own world champion, Bobo Brazil, who held what was considered to be a major title, comparable to the NWA, AWA, or WWF Championship. This would change in 1968, when LaBelle and another California promoter, Roy Shire, were convinced into joining the NWA by Sam Mushnick, who served for many years as a trusted figure and problem solver amongst territories. Being a member of the NWA back in this era meant that promoters had to adhere to several rules, the most important of which was that they weren't allowed their own world champion anymore, and would have to acknowledge the NWA world champion, who at the time was Gene Kiniski. In the 1970s, Mike LaBelle would often sell out the 15,000-seat Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles, where shows would be held on Wednesday and Friday nights. The venue is famous for various sports, most notably boxing, wrestling, and roller derby. The building was also used as a venue for the 1932 Olympic Games, hosting boxing, wrestling, and weightlifting. Opened in 1925, the venue briefly closed through much of the 80s, in part due to the closure of LaBelle Promotions, but was still active from 93 to around 2005, even hosting an ECW pay-per-view, Heatwave in 2000. The building is still there, but now operates as a church. The venue is also famous for being used in many boxing and wrestling films, including the first 3 Rocky movies, Raging Bull, and even the David Arquette classic, Ready to Rumble. I suppose not being far from Hollywood made it a great place to film such scenes. Another accomplishment of LaBelle was that in 1971, he's credited as promoting one of the first known closed-circuit wrestling events. The event would be held on July 30th, 1971, and would not only sell out the Olympic Auditorium, but also drew 4,000 more fans to the nearby Warren and Orpheum theatres to watch the closed-circuit broadcast. This would take place 14 years before WrestleMania 1, which relied heavily on closed-circuit screenings to turn a profit before pay-per-view would take over. One of the more notable feuds that LaBelle would promote would be John Tolos vs Classy Freddie Blassie, even drawing an estimated number between 18 and 25,000 fans at the much larger LA Coliseum. In May of that year, they'd begun a story where Blassie would be blinded by powder and may never wrestle again. He would return in July to build to the big match that would take place at the Coliseum. According to Dave Meltzer's obituary of LaBelle from his passing in 2009, Mike was considered very business-minded, so when the Blassie-Tolos rematch didn't draw as much, he ended the program early, possibly leaving money on the table for more rematches. Despite being LaBelle's top draw for much of the 60s, Blassie in particular didn't get along with LaBelle, stemming from what he thought was a low payment for the Coliseum show. In his 2003 autobiography, Freddie Blassie would write, "Even during the best of times, I was waiting for him to put a hatchet in my back." It's safe to say that Mike wasn't popular with a lot of wrestlers over pay-related issues, but that's not a complaint exclusive to him in the territory days. Later into the 70s, LaBelle would hit it big with another headlining feud, as his top heel, Rowdy Roddy Piper, would battle the beloved Guerrero family. Chavo Guerrero in particular, the brother of Eddie Guerrero, and father of the Chavo Guerrero who is still around wrestling today. LaBelle is credited as being the promoter who would discover and elevate Piper, and from LA he would go on to Portland, where he would become a star in that territory too, before making it to WWE. Chavo, as well as his brothers Mando and Hector, who by the way would play the gobbledygooker in WWE, would be young stars for LaBelle, but by this time business was declining from the glory days of the mid-60s to 70s. By 1980, the promotion was doing badly, drawing 4,000 at the Olympic Auditorium, where they used to draw much more. By this time, LaBelle was surviving based on his Spanish-language broadcasts, which were aired internationally. In 1982, the promotion would finally close its doors, and in 1983, Vince McMahon would buy television time in LA as part of his national expansion. Mike LaBelle would briefly work for Vince to promote WWF shows in Los Angeles, but this relationship fell through once Vince had established his shows in the area and no longer needed LaBelle. So with a bit of background, let's get to the monster. The wrestler this is referring to is a man called Cornelio Hernandez, better known as Tony Hernandez, who seems to have spent most of his wrestling career in Arizona and California. Later in his career, perhaps with a little influence from Hollywood, Hernandez would adopt a new gimmick, inspired by the many films starring Mary Shelley's 1818 creation. He would be billed as the Monster, basically a blatant rip-off of Frankenstein's monster. As you might expect, the Monster would lurch around the ring and barely sell for his opponents. Does that remind you of anyone? It should remind you of a few different wrestlers, going to show just how much wrestling has changed. If you go back and watch the first year or so of The Undertaker in WWE, you'll find a very different performer from the man who stole many a WrestleMania decades later. Undertaker would often plod slowly around the ring and perform very simple offense, much of which being chokes. The Frankenstein's monster influence was obvious, but not overbearing, so maybe that's why he got away with it. From what I can gather, the Observer Award was given because once the Monster arrived in LaBelle Promotions in 1981, he was promoted as being a man built in a laboratory, a real-life Frankenstein's monster, as opposed to clearly a gimmick. While it's easy to look back with modern eyes and not see much wrong with such a wacky gimmick, given some of the things we've seen over the years, when Hernandez arrived in LaBelle Promotions, the fans hated him, and not in the way a wrestling promoter wants you to hate their heel. Just imagine what those fans would have thought of PCO being restarted from a car battery. The fans who were going to the Olympic Auditorium were likely also going to the weekly boxing cards in the same building, and showing those fans a supposed horror movie character was likely not going to go down well. Legend has it that there was someone else who despised the monster gimmick, Andre the Giant, who himself for a time wrestled under the name Monster Rusimov. There's a story of a match that took place between Andre and the Monster, where the real-life giant was so offended at being asked to sell for the Monster that in the ring he worked rough with him, going as far as to rip his Frankenstein mask off. This caused a big problem for LaBelle Promotions. What do you do when your big, unstoppable monster has just been embarrassed by Andre the Giant? Well, you turn him babyface, of course. The promotion apparently went as far as to put on Picture with the Monster Nights, going full gear into making him as family friendly as possible. Here's a random trivia note that fits in around this time too. 1 year after the Observer Award, Hernandez would appear in the 1982 film Losing It, which according to IMDb is the first starring role of Tom Cruise. His role is credited as Big Guy in Jail. When you look at some of the later winners of the Most Disgusting Promotional Tactic Award, this one feels a little tame. Many of the ones that would follow would revolve around the exploitation of a wrestler's death or capitalizing on other real-life tragedies. Had Tony come around a decade later, maybe he wouldn't have won this dishonorable award. But if he had come around later, would I still be talking about him right now? Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe.